Okay.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Children of Gaia panel. So we are going to discuss the sci-fi fantasy epic series Children of Gaia, which is currently a work in progress. So I want to start by introducing the two panelists, Jayel Draco
Hey.
and Chris Covelli. These two are collaborators who've been working on the Children of Gaia concept and series for approximately 2 decades.
Maybe more than that.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Somewhere around the mid-90s.
So what I want to ask first, so that everyone's on the same foot here, is logistically speaking, in our world, what is Children of Gaia?
So Children of Gaia is it's an epic sci-fi fantasy series, right? And it's a series that, as of now, is planned to be told across several different books. But right now it exists in book form. We'd love to take it to other media one day. We've talked many times about the idea of it being a television show, animations, movies, video games, board games, tabletop games,
We'd like to have Children of Gaia encompass as many different mediums as possible. It's a huge world, spanning eons of years, and whole worlds, and rises and falls of empires, and we really want to cover as much ground as possible.
So what exists now? We've got this book here in front of us. Let's show everybody the book.
So this is the Great Nations of Rendaria. This book is basically a lore and backstory book, which is designed, to be an introduction to the series. But rather than being just a directly informative lore and backstory book, such as a Cogtionary or Cogopedia or something, Cog being Children of Gaia, sorry. Some of you know that already. But, so this is actually written and illustrated by a fictional character in the series Children of Gaia. So in this story, in this world, there is this character, Jan Kazian, who wrote this book to help preserve the memory of these nations that were destroyed. He's a survivor. He's living as a refugee while he's writing this and several other books that I also intend to make at least 1 or 2 more books from his perspective. So that's this book. And we have another one that's almost done.
We're planning another book that takes place in another realm of this universe. It's called War Horses. It's sort of a cowboy western themed story with a dangerous gunslinger.
So is that going to be similar in format to this book, like lots of art?
This is going to be more of like a novel, illustrated novel, where this is more of a Great Nations is kind of more of a lore, like world building, informative book with story elements, whereas this is a War Horses is going to be a plot-driven novel with tons of art and illustrations as well. But it will follow a climactic story.
Alright. Okay, so this is going to maybe be a tough question to answer, but I want to see what you say. So how are Great Nations of Rendaria and War Horses related? And sort of the bigger question there is, what's the story? I know that's a big question, but maybe if you can tie the 2 books together, maybe that'll be like a nice through line.
So, Children of Gaia takes place across these 2 realms, Terra and Rendaria. The Great Nations of Rendaria is a book describing a lot of features and characteristics of one of these worlds, Rendaria, whereas war horses will take place in the other realm called Terra. And these two worlds are interrelated in that one is trying to invade the other. Terra is trying to take over and conquer Rendaria,
So, yeah, I think the initial idea is that these two worlds are very different from one another. One is very much like imperialized, globalized, collection of technocracies. It's a battle of supremacy on Terra, and we see a lot of like familiar callbacks and references to like Victorian era, like turn of the century, Western frontier, that kind of stuff. Like that's the general theme and aesthetic. And then Rendaria is mostly like high fantasy kind of world where there's characters that resemble elves and orcs and that type of thing. So we're really painting the dichotomy here, the juxtaposition with these two books, and that's why we decided to do Great Nations and More Horses. They're related enough, and you can see that there's similarities in the writing style and in the illustration style, but they're so vastly different, and that should make you want to question like the ways in which they're related. That's kind of the point there. And then we have follow-up books, of course, which will begin to thread them together. Another such follow-up book, actually, that Chris is currently working on is The Layman's Guide to the Empire, which is specifically about, it's a lore and backstory and history book on the Terran empires,
right?
And it mirrors Great Nations.
Yeah, whereas Great Nations gives you a lot of information about sort of societies and peoples of Rendaria. Layman's Guide to the Empire will be doing the same for Terra. Describe 10 different political nations loosely collaborating to try to invade and take over Rendaria, and kind of outline what the people of Terra are like. Political squabbling that often goes on with such a power-hungry based society.
Okay, so it sounds to me like you described the series as a sci-fi fantasy series, and it sounds like Rendaria is more of the sort of typical fantasy side of the story. Does that mean that Terra is a little bit more of a sci-fi, like a little bit more technologically based than magic?
Yes. So Rendaria has a lot of magic within it. A lot of the people, a lot of characters can use magic, whereas on Terra, they're vastly differing levels of technology that the Terrans use because they don't have magic.
So these two realms, there's crossover because the Terrans are going over into Rendaria. So is that magic? Is it technology? How does that work? Or is that too much of a spoiler?
To keep this spoiler free, we'll just say yes.
It's a mixture of
All right. Okay. So bringing this to a little bit more of a personal place, maybe. Like what you're describing is really big. There's like nations and realms and a lot going on. So what's sort of the human element that is going to be bringing people into this story? Is it through Jankazian?
Okay, so Great Nations is narrated by the author, the fictional author, this character Jan Cassian, and he's telling his story, and he's describing these nations that were destroyed as he remembers them. the next book slated to come out is War and Horses, and that's being told by Landon Ford, who's a fictional character. He's a journalist writing this dime novel style nonfiction. It's kind of a spaghetti western. It's definitely, there's elements of like, I don't know, sensationalism, right? And there is also like legit reporting, like he's taking photos of things and finding evidence and collecting it, but then most of the book is his dramatization, his, dramatic reenactment of how things went based on the information he was able to collect. And then he throws in photos of people that he talked to and whatever. Those photos are, of course, illustrations that Chris and I are making, also like diagrammatical sketches and drawings throughout the book to help illustrate what he's talking about. But that story is being told by Landon. We have other books that are like...
So in addition to these two books that we're currently publishing, we are also working on an entire series of books told through a wide cast of characters that will mostly experience the world of children of Gaia through these characters and their struggles. They across Terra, across Rendaria, crossing over between the worlds, trying to escape some of the war, the fighting, trying to pick up the pieces of some of the destruction. So the human element, the personal element is definitely going to be told through characters.
It's very character-driven. And actually, I mean, that's an important point of it, because so much of our work is backstory and world building that, I've had people ask, like, is it just a board game? Like, are there even characters? And we're like, there's a large cast of characters, and each one of them does get their own spotlight to be a focal point. So that's why it's a series of collected works, as well as like what we're calling the core, storyline, right? Is like this main story arc that has a bunch of characters in it. Jen Kazian, the author of this book, is actually in it. Characters from War and Horses are actually in the main story. Layman's Guide to the Empire that Chris is working on has characters that are actually going to be in the story. It's what we're doing is putting out all the side pieces first.
Right. Our first.
Okay.
What do you think?
Jen Kazian's my side piece.
The first few books we're currently publishing and we're getting out there are sort of teasers, I guess.
Okay. So these are like Silmarillion to Lord of the Rings, sort of like supplemental.
They're supplemental in a way, but they come out first, so they're like a good. They're introductory pieces, so they are. They give you a deeper sense and appreciation for the setting, backstory, history.
Sort of the richness.
We decided to put these smaller works out because they're easier to do. The undertaking of writing these huge main story books taking us quite a while, whereas these shorter projects we're able to work on, get them out there.
Right. Okay.
People.
We got a question.
Do the short ones stand alone as a story? Like, could I just, buy one short story and, maybe a couple years later pick up another one and I won't be confused?
Absolutely. And I think even, going back to what I was kind of getting at earlier was the idea that, like, War and Horses and Great Nations are so different that they might just seem completely standalone. Like, they might seem like two different projects from the same publisher, and it isn't until you know more that you start to see how directly they are related.
Okay. So, I feel like I now need to ask the question, like, what's your elevator pitch version of what's the story? What happens?
So the story is basically the war between Terra and Rendaria. Terra is a world where the empires of this world have kind of drained the resources, and they find a way to make it to Rendaria, which is a lush, green, healthy world. Has a lot more land, a lot more resources, and they cross over to the world and try to take it over. And the whole story revolves around this conflict.
So it's a colonization
Yes.
story. I think there's another panel today about colonization. Yeah, that's interesting. Right. Okay. All right. So, since I don't want to give away too many spoilers, you keep saying we're working on it. Is it just the two of you?
Well, no, it's also you. It's
I knew the answer to that question.
It's also Pete. It's also Jenny. We've got a few other people helping us develop other aspects of it. I mean, at this point we're a team of 6 people,
Yeah.
7 people,
6 minds that are
6 writers,
Going
6
through-
writers.
going through, tossing out ideas, collaborating to make this giant world make sense and to be put to a followable story,
Right.
which is harder than it's meant.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of story. There's a lot of world. There's a lot of even like folklore and mythology to be waded through to get to the story part. So you're working with 6 people, including myself now.
We're working with more than that, but I mean 6 writers. 6 of us are in the group, right? We have like other people that are, I think, what we would say more like, I don't know, collaborative, but not like collaborators.
But it started with the 2 of you.
Yes.
Where did it start? Through the mists of time.
Back in the
Tell us.
1900s, before the turn of the millennium, a millennium ago, in Mr. Saul's social studies class. Yeah. So, I mean, when we first met, we were both playing with our action figures that we modified ourselves, and we found out that we both did that, and we were like, hey, that's cool, because a lot of other people don't play with that stuff anymore, and people that do don't have stories behind it, so we introduced each other to our own characters and our own things that we were making and building, and so naturally our characters got to know each other, and then they developed common backstories, and those backstories that was the beginning of what would evolve, being torn down and rebuilt, and being rewritten and remade, eventually became what Children of Gaia is today.
Essentially, this entire story, this entire endeavor came out of Teasers. That's probably the best, most succinct way to put it.
So is Children of Gaia the story of their friendship?
Absolutely.
So one of you invaded the other one, trying to take over, exploit your resources. I mean, that's a pretty interesting story unto itself.
Sure. Be a good file.
Someday. All right. Well, so especially here at SpoCon, I've been talking to a lot of people who are also world builders. It's sort of a big theme in a lot of the panels that are going on this weekend too. So what sets Children of Gaia apart from other big fantasy epics? What's different?
Everything.
Oh, well, that's simple.
Well, I think the amount of brain power that we have going into it. You know, I mean, 6 people just pouring like all of their cognitive reasoning into what we want to see in worlds that exist that humans cannot get to. We can only tell new stories about them from our dreams. And when you have 6 people just focusing all their brain energy into making that as real as possible, it's gonna be different.
I think it's in addition to having six brains, six times the brain power of any other, whatever that means. I think it's also where does it talk about there's 6 different perspectives.
Yeah.
I think that really allows us to deeply explore a lot of themes, a lot of personalities of characters. I think our characters are very, very deep, very considered, and very rich in terms of their backstories, in terms of their decisions that they make. And I think we come from the 6 of us come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and I think that shows in the work. It tries to be as inclusive as possible to as many people as possible. This isn't a sci-fi fantasy story for a target audience. I think we're really trying to make it applicable to everybody. Anybody who's interested, anybody can find something to latch on to.
Okay, that's an interesting way of putting it. 'Cause I mean, as a woman person, I often find myself a little disappointed by a lot of fantasy universes, because sometimes I'm just like I've heard the same story before, you know? I know these characters, and could you at least come up with names for groups of people that are slightly different from the Earth version of it, you know? And I happen to know, because I'm working on it, the Children of Gaia doesn't really follow that same script. It's not like, oh, this is the nation that's basically Arab people, and this is the nation that's basically East Asian people. It's not as directly following
1-to-1.
Yeah, it's not like a 1-to-1 ratio.
Classic fantasy
And I
tropes.
think, the cool thing about that is we have Terra and Rendaria, and I think Rendaria is very alien in a lot of ways, and I think Terra kind of, I don't want to say parodies, but
Terra is definitely meant to be more familiar. To
it almost
Western
calls out things about Earth history.
Yeah.
Right?
There are parallels, there are similarities that we find between events that happen in Terra's history to Earth history, and I think it's a great juxtaposition of having that familiarity, that this is the familiar world, and then Rendaria is extremely different. Very even in, it's different in the types of species that are sentient and have societies, but even the societies themselves on Rendaria are sort of atypical, at least modern day civilizations. The cultures, the customs.
I think the amalgamations are more widespread. We'll take concepts that existed in this small tribe. There was this concept in Earth history, and then in this big feudal European country, there was this concept, and we've combined them in a way that's maybe almost unbelievable, uncanny. These ways of making these cultures that are yeah, I guess now that you made that, it seems real, but I can't think of anything that exists that's like that. And that's intentional. It's intentional to say, again, the parallels to Earth versus the discrepancies, the departures from Earth. And it shows 2 very different pictures of possibilities of histories of cultures, right? So like that's really what we're getting at there is how things can go completely differently or be more of the same, and what are those differences? You know, what about them is good? What about them is bad? What about them is strong? What about them is weak? You know,
Yeah, and I think a big difference between our universe that we're creating and some others is it's less black and white in terms of good versus evil. Sure, we have Terra that's trying to invade Rendaria, and you could call that evil. You know, it's violent, it's imperial, it's destructive, but we're very careful not to blanketly make the Terrans are evil. They're the bad guys, and then the Rendarians are the good guys. We definitely are careful to show examples of Terran characters that are good guys. There are Rendarian characters that are antagonists. We have a very rich, experience of any type of story you can imagine. Probably touch on these two realms.
That's actually a really good point, I think. You know, in like so much fantasy, it's like, oh, the evil forces of such and such the sorcerer, and you never get to know such and such the sorcerer, or
there's no evil wizard.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a lot of stories, it's like
we tend not to focus.
Understood that they're the bad guys because they're evil, and that's it. There's nothing good about them. There never will be. There never was. They just have to be beaten. And in real life, you know, like in real life, everybody has good and bad in them, and everybody has motivations. And sometimes large groups of people do horrible things. Does that mean they were all born evil? No, they're people. So what motivates a large group of people to do a horrible thing, and how can we solve that? You know, what kind of resolve can we come to? We couldn't possibly ever come to a resolve by thinking an entire group of people are just inherently evil, right? Like in Earth history, any war, you know what I mean? Like, there's always still a human element, and I think a lot of stories neglect that. They neglect people that are caught in the crossfire. Someone who's just doing their job and trying not to get their family killed, and like now they're feeding an army, and like they just wanted to be a farmer, or maybe they didn't even want to be a farmer. Maybe they didn't have any choice. They were just born a farmer, and now they're supplying an army with food. Like, you know what I mean? There's a lot more that goes on, and I think we're trying to show that.
Okay. So you brought up the idea of like trying to solve those problems. Is there a solution that Children of Gaia has, or is it more about asking questions?
I think personally, we don't want to get too spoilerific, but it is much about asking those questions, and not even just asking them, just showing scenarios that are naturally going to make you ask those questions. You know, like if you show a scenario enough in enough light from enough perspectives, those questions are just going to come up. You know, like they should anyway. If you've done your job right, people are going to be like, "Hey, that's a good point." It's like, I didn't make a point. I just showed you something. You know, like you made the point because you saw it clearly. You know.
I think at the core of what we're trying to do is address problems that we see in the real world. Problems being war, destruction, improper distribution of resources, greed, all of these things, and
Colonization.
So
basically,
yeah,
what all of that.
all of that. And if we had a definite solution to those problems that face the world, we wouldn't be writing a fantasy epic. We wouldn't be putting this into a story. We'd probably just be writing a political manifesto and trying to run for office because we don't have these solutions. But I think by addressing these problems, by presenting them in a new way, I think that suggest people thinking about it, talking about it, and maybe somebody will have the solution.
I'll say this, I'll argue, and this isn't me playing devil's advocate, this is me just posing my opinion. I think a political manifesto might make a change in a society for a generation, maybe a generation. It might make a lasting change for people, but a solid piece of artwork that makes a contribution that can ripple out forever. I mean, we don't even know, works of art that are still referenced today from hundreds of years ago that will forever constantly become part of every manifesto that's written. I mean, so there's just different, to each their own, and I think this is what we can do, so this is what we are doing, and that's fine.
I hadn't really thought of it this way before, but a lot of the time, sci-fi is fictionalized manifesto. For a lot of sci-fi articles, it's very, very political. And you tend to see less of that in fantasy, but a lot of what you're saying, it always sounds like you got sort of the sci-fi ideas that are being sort of played out in a fantasy setting.
Yeah, that can be said. Whereas sci-fi is often trying to predict the future.
Yeah.
So the best sci-fi is trying to say what's going to be coming in society. And fantasy is more tends to be more about morality lessons. These fables that touch on. Word, but there's ethical questions raised by both in both fantasy and sci-fi. And I think the reason that we kind of use the term sci-fi fantasy is that it tries to predict something that we can see happening, and it also tries to kind of turn it into more allegorical lesson about things that have happened, things that could happen, that are currently happening.
Yeah, the human condition, but also not always human.
Right. The humanoid condition.
Yeah.
And I think, it's important to point this out, that a lot of people tend to see a discrepancy between the concept of magic or spirit or energy, something like that, and the concept of electricity and digital and robot. You can only have one of those in a universe. You couldn't possibly have both. And it's yeah, but both of those concepts originate on this Earth. We have both of those concepts on our planet Earth. Why can't we have both of them in a work of fiction, right? So in the Children of Gaia universe, you might actually see a robot, and you might also see a wizard, and they're both there, there's apples and oranges in our
ancient gods and futuristic spaceships and lasers and dragons with lasers, maybe.
Flying jellyfish.
Some of those might just be red herrings, by the way.
I mean, I don't know. I would probably come up with a way to work in a dragon with a laser on its head. It might be worth it. Just saying. So, okay. What you mentioned that there's a lot of other books in the works. What are some other projects that are in the pipeline?
Well, so we briefly touched upon Layman's Guide. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Okay. So Layman's Guide is the title is Layman's Guide to the Empire, and similar to Great Nations, it's written from the perspective of a character in the story. This character, his name is Dimitri Salvanos, and he is so on Terra there are these different houses that have they were once a great unified empire, and now they are a collection of 10 houses that are trying to cooperate in their endeavors to take over Rendaria. And one of the houses has had a civil war, which they've overthrown their aristocracy and have started a republic government. And this republic government has held a free election and elected a common man. No noble birth.
Yes.
This is one of the. This is shocking. Probably the first time in Terran history that democracy has occurred. And so, Layman's Guide to the Empire is sort of a book written for this new character, Byron Adelson, who's been elected as the chairman of the Republic of Draven. And this is sort of his guidebook to being a statesman.
It's like the briefcase that the president gets, right?
Right.
So
This is sort of like a dossier to help him familiarize himself with all of the political machinations of the empire, which he doesn't have the background for it. I mean, most on Terra, most lords that come into power, and maybe they were going to private rule from birth. They've had lessons about political strategy, and then this guy's had none of that. The people elected him because they felt that he would represent their interests well.
He was like a cogsmith originally.
So yeah, Byron Adelson was a steel worker early in his life, and he worked on frames for large sailing ships. And he rises in the ranks of this company to the point where instead of just hammering out steel frames, he's designing, he's drafting these ships, and eventually he ends up becoming the owner of this shipbuilding company. He becomes vastly rich. He's a self-made man, which is something that the people of his nation really get behind, because they see him as, hey, he did it, we can do it. We can achieve all this together. We don't need nobles. We don't need the aristocracy. We don't need this gentry to control everything.
He's their proof of possibility.
So he's a very it's in the book that he's very good at handling domestic affairs. He knows what people want, and he's a good representative of people's desires. But he doesn't know anything about foreign affairs, about the larger empire around him. So this book is sort of it's part Terran history, and it's part like political strategy for him to prepare to rule and to represent his people in the larger empire.
And also like low key textbook for people who want to learn about Terra.
Right. This is a clever guise to really get into the hard history of this world that you don't have to know in order to enjoy the main storyline of our books, but it's great supplement.
I think I can briefly glaze over a few more projects that we have in the works, and then I think we're out of time. So, another project in the works that's nearly completed is an 8-page short comic that will be in one of our Oneshi Press anthologies. Whenever it's finished, I'm not sure which anthology that will be. That's called Refuge, and actually Jan Kazian is a side character in that comic. That's kind of just another little fun introductory short, really short, 8 pages long action adventure kind of story. And after that, we're working on a book called Regions of Rendaria and Their Inhabitants. And that is going to be kind of similar to Great Nations, and it's written by Jan Kazian and illustrated by Jan Kazian, so it'll all be in this same familiar style again, And Whereas this book focuses on the Great Nations, these large cotter-pin nations that kind of umbrella the cultures and societies around them in proximity. This other book is going to be about those other cultures and societies, the smaller ones, the tribe that no one's heard from in 100 years that lives in those woods, and that, whole tribe over there, and, all these just smaller, scattered nations around Bulgaria. Many of them still exist and have not been destroyed, and many of them are starting to join forces, hopefully to win back some of what was taken from them in this force of colonization. So that will be another book coming up, is Regions of Rendaria and Their Inhabitants, which is actually mentioned in this book. And another one is an anthology piece that we're working on. We're working on conceptually at this point. We haven't actually started any footwork on it. But as a group, we're all going to have our own contributions. And I've even had interest from some people outside of our immediate core group. So that will be specifically about the Philesteata, which are a character, not a character, a type of creature. They're like these big, I don't know if you guys can see that at all, big floating, thanks. Oh yeah, thanks. Flying jellyfish type creatures. So we're going to have an anthology about them, and some of those stories will be told from their perspective, some of those stories will be told about them. Some of the stories might be told from an Imperial's perspective about these creatures that they're harvesting, and some of them might be about some native tribal societies' views on those creatures, and so that should be interesting and fun. We've got a few other books in the works behind that. There's one that we're talking about now, which is an expedition journal, which will be a Terran expedition guide who leads an expedition into Rendaria specifically to plan out paths and possible trade routes and places. Right, exactly. So, and that should be really fun. And we have I'm sure something to that extent, something similar. But yeah, that's actually going to be written by my brother, who is actually an expedition leader. So, he studied expeditionary studies as well as tourism. So we've got a really eclectic group and an eclectic body of works, and they're going to, each one is just going to explain and explore, explaining through first-hand exploration more about these worlds and how they're connected, and more things are going to start cross-referencing and threading into each other. So that should be cool.
I'm going to just take this quick moment to do a plug. All of these books, hopefully, so far have been, and hopefully in the future will be, published by Oneshi Press, which is the independent publishing company that Jayel and I have created. And we have a booth here, so if anybody wants to stop by,
come to our booth. It's right outside
go through a copy of the book and see our other work. We
merchants.
do other stuff. So.
It's true. We're right outside the dealers. Right.
Yeah.
Dealers line. Yeah.
Okay. So
okay,
out
I
of
think
time.
that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much.
Woo!